Trail and ultra runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the KoopCast. As always, I'm your host, Coach Jason Koop, and this podcast is all about footwear innovation in the trail and ultra running space. On the podcast today, I have Sebastien Pavailer and Marlene Giandolini of the Salomon Sports Science Laboratory out of Annecy, France. We discuss how research done in the lab actually lands on your feet and how you benefit from some of the research being done out of Salomon's lab. I've always appreciated how Seb, Marlene, and other scientists like them take a solutions-oriented approach to research, and it shows up in Salomon's wide range of products, which are some of the most heralded in the marketplace today. As with all of my podcasts, there are no financial conflicts of interest between me or Salomon. I just appreciate what they do. So I hope you enjoy this one as we peel back the curtain on how your shoes come to be. Let's get right into it. Here's my conversation with Sebastien and Marlene over at Salomon. Right on the onset, mentioned that things were weird. And we have that experience here too. I mean, we have a physiology lab at our home office in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And we've been going back and forth between, do we open it up for physiological testing? And we just do, standard graded exercise tests and things like that. It's not a biomechanics lab. It's very much more of a, what I would call kind of a performance laboratory, an endurance performance laboratory. But we've gone back and forth between, do we open it up? Do we do it with these restrictions? Is it worth opening back up and things like that? So is your lab actually open now? Are you like bringing athletes in for testing and things like that? What is the state of it?
If you can take this one.
Okay. So we are still open, and we still have the opportunity to run some testing while respecting all the, how can I say that?
Restrictions.
The restriction rules and so on.
Yeah.
So, but it's pretty rare. We try to do only the tests that are, how can I say that? That are really useful for projects and yeah. So we try to minimize basically our activity in the lab and only do what is absolutely necessary for a development project. So we do some biomechanical testings and some sensory analysis and so on, but yeah.
So explain to me the setup, because a lot of the listeners, once again, we have a lay audience. They know running, they know testing and things like that, but try to like describe visually what the lab is like. How big is it? What kind of equipment do you have? What athletes are coming into the lab and things like that, just so we can start to paint this picture, since this is going to be a big part of the whole conversation.
I can start with this one. So we have this kind of big room, it's around 150 square meter. So it's kind of big. And it's equipped with let's say two types of measurement device. Some of them are fixed in the lab. So we have 3 force platforms. We have also 8 cameras around them. The cameras are not that fixed because we could dismount them and take them outside to do some measurements. But basically, the lab is set up with those 8 cameras. And so it's pretty convenient to let them in place. And so this is the basic setup. We can have people and athletes come into the lab, just run or walk through this kind of pathway, where the force platforms are, and we can do this kind of conventional analysis where we can measure forces and the 3D movement as well, and then calculate some metrics based on those measurements. And the other devices that we have are some portable ones that we're able to take outside the lab, so pressure insoles, inertial units, accelerometers. So we have EMG sensors that are kind of, they are mostly used in the lab, but we can take them outside. And so the idea is to be able to have this kind of standardized setup in the lab, but also be able to get some of the devices outside to have some real world measurement, especially in trail running, for example. It's difficult to replicate trail running in a lab setup. So that's why we have those 2 types of device. I don't know if you want to add something.
We really strive, since we are working on outdoor activities, we really strive to have devices that we can bring outside the lab. It's very important for us, and especially in trail running, as Seb just mentioned. And just to add something, we also recently received gas analyzer, so we try also to do more physiological measurements to have a direct measurement evaluation of performance. And we also have a nice outside track, just going from inside the lab to outside the lab to analyze, to do some routine tests about cushioning, about ride, really to have a standardized track to do our less original measurements, let's say.
And the whole setup of the lab, is it part of Amer Sports, like all of the different, like the whole portfolio of companies that are underneath Amer Sports? Do they have access to the lab at various points, or is it just Salomon?
So I'd say it's just Salomon, and officially it would be just Footwear, actually, because all the devices and the place was set up by the Footwear department and financed as well by the Footwear department. So that doesn't mean that we do not share our toys, with the other departments. So if the winter sports department needs to do some tests, it's more than possible, But officially, it's a Footwear dedicated lab, and as far as Amer Sports is concerned, so what you need to know is that for Footwear, the Salomon headquarters here in Annecy is identified as a, let's say, competitivity a pole, for footwear development. So meaning that we are not only working on Salomon shoes, but also Wilson, tennis shoes, and Arc'teryx for hiking, mountaineering shoes. So meaning this Footwear lab could be intended for testing tennis shoes or Arc'teryx shoes. And actually, I worked for Wilson for my, the 3 first years of my career were dedicated to working on Wilson shoes. And as far as the other, brands of the Amer Group are concerned, some of them have some facilities in their headquarters to do some sports science as well. But for us, it's basically around that.
And something also I think that that is interesting also to have in mind is that when we arrived with Seb in Salomon, it was 8 years ago. 8 years ago. Yeah, the lab was a kind of 40-meter squares kind of cave in the basement with no windows, with just one very old treadmill that we still have actually, and just plantar pressure insoles and something like this. And so now, and herd belt. And now we have this, so it's not the Nike lab, but we have a pretty nice lab with very sophisticated devices and so on. And the team is also growing up. And so I think that this allows really that over the past few years, Amer Sports put a lot of investment on the sports sciences, basically. And especially for running footwear.
And this is kind of what I wanted to get at is it didn't start out that way. Just like anything else, it's not like it appeared magically out of the ground or an ongoing project. And I'm glad I heard you two describe it, because I've asked athletes that have been there and they haven't been able to quite like paint the picture as well as you have, because you guys have a more intimate sports science knowledge of it. But you have a lab that is on par or better than a lot of the major universities here in the United States, both in terms of like the quality of the equipment that you have, but also the sheer range of things that you can do that you pointed out. I mean, you've got biomechanics stuff. You've got things that can measure EMG, so we're looking at the muscles. You've got metabolic capabilities. You can go indoors, outdoors to kind of try to get a better representation of what's actually going on in the field, which I think is lost in a lot of sports science since we try to kind of control those things in the lab. And I've always been rather impressed with that array, even when I've heard it described from an athlete. So you guys have all these really cool toys, right? And at the end of the day, the information that you glean from all of these toys goes into footwear,
Absolutely.
How does that process actually happen? Because you have a huge line of footwear, mainly trail running, but I think that you have done a good job of having kind of like specialty shoes. You've got a shoe for mud, you've got a shoe for, high traction situations, you've got a shoe that drains really well, you've got a shoe that's kind of more of an all-purpose shoe, a road to trail shoes and thing like that. How do you guys take this research and actually put it into a product?
Do you want to comment on that?
Vas-y,
So it basically, what I used to say is that it basically starts with some questions. We are question answerers, and so could be, we want to improve downhill performance in trail running, for example. We want to improve running economy for road running, for example, and Nike did that pretty well in the last years. We want to improve stability in hiking. Could be those kind of questions. And for any of those questions, you have a fundamental part to address. Let's say I want to improve stability in hiking. I need to really define what stability is and what are the key biomechanical indicators of this parameter, let's say. So this starts with this very fundamental question, and so we have some testing to answer this question and say, okay, this is what stability is. And answering this question, we gather a lot of knowledge into what is the hiking movement, how we can measure that, how the body interacts with the shoe and the ground, and can give us some ideas to transfer that into shoe concepts. And then the loop is looped, let's say, and we can test the different concepts that we have imagined, and see if the metrics that we identify in the first phase are optimized by the concept that we have imagined in the second phase.
Basically to add something on that, I think that as sports scientists in Salomon, we have, I would say, 3 missions. The first one, as I said, is really fundamental, is really close at what we can do in a research lab, in a university lab. And in this first step, in this first mission, what we want to know is basically what are, for example, the main criteria of performance in trail running, for example, or let's say, what do we have to focus on to have better performance in trail running. So we can identify that downhill section as are very important for performance, or we can identify that, I don't know, uphill speed in uphill section are also important. And so the goal here is really to understand what are the performance criteria of a given activity, and to really have a description of this. And then in a second time, our second mission, I think, if I have to explain it, would be what we call here innovation. And this is mostly done by all the collaboration that we're going to have with the designers, with the developers, and so on. So here we will try to go from an Excel file to, let's say, a really product design, and how to apply the knowledge to the product, basically. And then we have a third mission. I would say it's more validation, as said. And here we will try to quantify the benefits of the new technology, of the concept, or whatever. And I would say that I think that today 80% of our time is on research and exploration.
Wow.
We are what we do all the day long, mostly.
That's absolutely unbelievable for a company that has to produce products, right? That you're spending 80% of your time just doing the background research and the innovative side of it, because that means very little of that actually makes it to the consumer.
Yeah, and basically what we try to do is really to understand the needs of the consumer. And so over the past few years, we focused a lot on biomechanics, but today we also focus on physiology, on sensory preferences, and so on. So we try to have a 36 degrees of description of the consumer, let's say, of the user, of the runner, of the hiker, or whatever.
Here's what I can appreciate about that approach is you guys are letting science kind of lead the way, right? You're looking at what dictates performance from a scientific perspective, and you're designing footwear products around that. And all too often, that first step gets missed. And we've seen this, and you guys have seen this in the footwear side of things, where all runners are injured. They've been injured since we started running, right? It's just a huge problem in running. Well, somebody at some point in time decided that the reason that we were all getting injured is because our shoes were too cushioned. And then they removed all the cushioning from the shoes. We saw this huge barefoot running movement kind of take over the world. Born to Run definitely facilitated that. But there was no data at the time to show that running barefoot actually decreased running injuries. And then, as a reaction to the barefoot movement, the overcushioned shoe movement, especially in trail running, started to take over as well and said, oh, well, we need more cushioning to prevent injury and improve performance. And I'm not knocking on Vibram or Hoka. They've got to produce products. I totally get it. And I like Hoka shoes. I run them a lot. But both of those had the same flaws in that they were just guessing at the answer to the problem, which was what improves performance or what prevents injury. And they produce products kind of like putting in a way that they were putting the cart before the horse, right? Before the science actually kind of came along. You guys are taking the opposite approach, is where you're looking at the landscape of the science and saying, okay, this is where it actually makes sense to put cushioning, to put traction, to put stability and things like that. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, sure. And just to add something again, is that I think that the paradigm that we embrace today is that those criteria of performance, and so the needs that are related to those criteria are highly runner specific. I mean, you do not have the same needs that I have, and Sebastien also has different needs, and so we are all different, and so our needs and the solutions, he's different as well, actually.
Yeah. And I've always thought that companies like Salomon that has to produce products, there's this fine line of following the science versus being on the leading edge of it. Because you can't ever get kind of like hot behind the trends, because then, 4 or 5 companies have kind of like outpaced you at the time. I want to know how that aspect of blending innovation and then keeping your products in a science-based, efficacious way, how you just internally blend those two. And I know that's a really hard question to answer, but I'm sure, as thoughtful as you are on the research side of things, you guys have thought about that as well.
Yeah, it's actually a current topic for me, on the projects that I work on. And the idea is to what's the right balance between pushing some concepts and some new technologies and pulling some needs from the market and from the runners. And like you said, it's kind of a touchy question. And so how we address that is pretty, let's say, pretty empirical. Is that we have some ideas, and some of the people in the company have some ideas and push some of the technologies and some of the concepts, and then we're trying that, seeing if it works in a way in the lab or in field testing or with some research about the literature and stuff like that. See if it makes sense, and try to find the right customers. And the customers could be end users, runners, or could be internally as well. Because sometimes, we just work on some process or something that can simplify the life of our colleagues. And so trying to make the link between this idea, this concept that was pushed with some idea, and with the need of the end user, is kind of the link between the R and the D, basically, in every R&D process. But it's kind of empirical, and I think we don't have the most precise answer yet.
Yeah, it's always a tough balance with companies, and I've gotten around to, like, you name it, Nike, Under Armour, and everybody kind of struggles with that with that yin and yang, that push and pull of putting innovative products out there, and at the same time having some sort of research-based efficacy to kind of lean on. And my opinion is some companies get that out of balance where they're pushing things out there too quickly. And sometimes they're right. They get the guess right that whatever technology or whatever they're kind of pushing ends up actually working when they just had really preliminary data that it would. And oftentimes they just get it wrong. And what ends up happening is they get so entrenched in the product that they've just developed that they keep pushing out nonsense that, you know, that has been proven to otherwise not have actually any sort of efficacy. So it's always, I always appreciate when companies can kind of strike that balance. And I think you guys have a really thoughtful process with it. Related to that, how much stuff gets put on the cutting room floor? Because if you're constantly like innovating and trying to put products out there, inevitably some of them like don't make the cut. And I know it's hard to say, well, it's exactly this percentage, but I think the listeners would appreciate how many things actually end up on the shelves of their local running store versus the things that are in U2's closet or in some other Salomon employee's closet that might get like one or two uses.
I don't know. Regarding exploration, I don't know in terms of products really, but I would say in terms of exploration projects, so really at a macroscopic level, I would say that each year, I think that we may stop half of the project that we start in January. I think that in December, half of them are stopped because it's not the right path, or I don't know. At the exploration level, I would say that it's something like this.
Yeah,
Said Marlene, I just wanted to clarify that you said at least half get stopped by the end of the year. The half.
Yeah, regarding the exploration projects, when I don't know, but maybe I would say that over this year, but it's not.
It's a tricky one because it's difficult and precise numbers. I think we don't have them, and we won't have the right to tell them. But what we can say is that for any given research project and where we have to do prototypes, and then how many what we can say is about how many prototypes we have on the cutting table before any product is released. And I have an example for a tennis shoe that I worked on when I was at the beginning of my career. And we did more than 150 prototypes before getting the shoe to work and to play, because it was a tennis shoe. So it's kind of a lot. And we have some, there are some thoughts to say, okay, how can we simulate some of the prototypes at the beginning of the process to try to reduce this number, because you can't build 200 shoes to sell one at the end of the day. So
right,
that are basically the numbers. 100 prototype for any project is something kind of usual for a research project.
And I think a lot of runners will find that astounding, because when they get running shoes, they still will find something to bitch and moan about, right? They'll still find something that like, oh, I just don't like this, I don't like that, which speaks more to the individual nature of our feet and how we use shoes versus the rigorous nature that you put into actually trying to figure out what's going to work and what's not to. I mean, the fact that you're going through, even 50, right, different prototypes to achieve one would be a really high number, but you're telling me it's 100 or 150 to 1. It's just incredible. So what might we see coming out of Salomon in the next few years? I know you guys have a long timeline to do R&D and to actually kind of come out with a product, and I don't want to like spoil anything for you guys, because I know you guys like to launch it and create a big buzz around it and things like that. But if you can like generally style some of the things that the consumers might actually see coming out of Salomon and out of your lab, I think it would be interesting for everybody. I think you guys are searching through your non-disclosure agreement memory banks
Yeah,
to find out what the example, which is totally. And I'm more than happy to take any of this out afterwards if you have to consult with your legal team. So feel free to tell me anything, and we can retract it later.
I think we can talk about two of our, innovation priorities that would be, how to say that, like lifestyle products. Let's say, there are some ranges that are on this era, sneaker shoe more than performance shoes. So it's kind of a hot topic. So if running Salomon fan like to wear shoes, just to go in the city and go outside. There are some ranges on the go. I think a second priority, and you could talk more than myself, is road running shoes, new road running shoes, because we launched some road running shoe ranges a few years ago. I think about two years ago for the first ones, and some new products are going to come. And I can comment on something on my side. The innovation project I'm involved in is about having nice and accurate shoe recommendations, and so how we can take some data on the customer, on the runner, and address him with the right shoe for his right usage, for his foot shape, for his biomechanics. So we're working on this kind of process. So we hope that we will come up in, I don't know, 2 years from now with some nice solutions to do that, either in store or in a distant, remote perspective.
I think that that's the next layer of footwear, is somehow a user being able to scan their foot with their phone or something that they can do in a shoe store, and then have the company of their choice make a shoe that fits their foot specifically, and then they can say, I want this type of traction, I want this type of cushioning, I want this type of upper. I mean, and shoe companies are, you guys know more than I do, they're really close to that. You guys might be close to that, just not leading onto it too much. But I think that that's the future, because once again, everybody wants their shoe a little bit different than when it comes off the shelf. I want the toe box a little bit wider. I want the heel cup a little bit more narrow. I want the lugs a little bit longer. I want a Vibram outsole instead of something else. And if a user can actually put all of those things together in a customized way, which I don't think we're that far away from, I think that that's the next step.
Yeah, and actually, not so. It was like 3 years ago. We had this kind of project of customized shoe. It was called Salomon Mesh.
Yes, I do
It
remember.
was, yeah, it was the really first steps into customized shoe, because we basically invented a new way to build the shoes, and it simplified greatly the process. And so the customer was able to choose his components, and it was easier to do that. The project was stopped because it was not mature. But I think you're right. It's just there. It's not that far to be able to do that more precisely and more customized, actually.
But I think that one outcome of this mesh project, something that I think we have learned, is that runners do not necessarily need a shoe that is customized to themselves, but something that we should be better at is to be more runner specific in the way we build the shoe, meaning that to have a more, let's say, how can I say that, to address needs for given functional groups, and not for try to have a shoe for everybody, but to be more specific to a target, to a runners group, for example. And so this is something that we are working on a lot also, to try to address the needs of a small group of the population, rather than trying to address to have the best shoe for everybody, because I think that it's just impossible, because we are too different regarding our biomechanics, our anatomy, our needs, our preferences, where we run, and so on. So I think that it's hard from one side. It's hard to have a single solution for every single runners, but it's also I think it's also somehow wrong also to try to have one solution for all the runners. So we try to be more specific also at this level.
Yeah, it's like I said, I think the future of it is fascinating, and if anything, the COVID pandemic has kind of accentuated this, right? Because we don't have the same type of access to go into our local running store and get fitted by somebody that's there and try on 10 pairs of shoes, which a lot of people do, right? And then finally kind of like walk out with the one that like feels best to them. And so companies like yourself and other footwear companies have tried to they try different strategies to get users into the right footwear without that hands-on type of experience, which is incredibly inordinately difficult.
Absolutely. And I think that more and more brands are working on this. So we are working on this, and other brands are also deeply working on this, like Bruce. So yeah, I think that this is one key part of innovation that is not directly related to the product itself, but that is still very, very important. Because as I often say, there is no bad footwear solution. Minimalism can be good for some kind of people, and maximalism can be good for other kind of people. But the thing is that who should wear what, basically, and who need what. And I feel that this is one of the golden question for the next years.
That's a great one to answer.
Well, because you have, millions of ends of one, right? That all need like slightly different variations of cushioning, stability, traction, depending upon the situation and things like that. So that point is really well taken, Marlene. I want to discuss a particular aspect of your lab that I find fascinating is you find examples in the research literature that have emanated from your lab, or at least in part or in whole, and it seems to at least be able to serve a dual purpose of where you can use your lab to internally help innovate and come up with products and do it more like internal type of documentation. This is how our footwear is going to look in 2 or 3 years. But you can also push that research out into the space where everybody gets access to it. And I want to explore the interface of that a little bit, because it's some of the research that I actually come into contact with when I'm using it in my coaching practice. And one of the pieces of research that, Marlene, you're actually the lead author on, is the title of it is fatigue associated with prolonged graded running, that was out of the European Journal of Applied Physiology. And I think it came out in 2016. I have that correct?
This one?
I'm testing everybody's memory.
Are you thinking about the review, or because we did write also a review, literature review about the effect of graded running on fatigue, and here, so it's more about the downhill running. Yes?
Yep, I've got that one pulled
so
up.
I think that it's papers from my thesis work, I would say. Then.
Well, I'll link both of those in the show notes, but the question really didn't have anything to do with the specific research, but it's more, I wanted to get your take on how you take like specific outcomes of a piece of research. Okay, we're looking at graded running, and we know that the joint torques are different at the ankle and the knee and the hip in an uphill and a downhill condition and things like that. I don't want to get caught in the weeds there, because that's 3 other podcasts that we can kind of talk about. But I want to kind of explore some like practical examples of how the outcomes of those research of that research actually ends up in a shoe. Like, how do you take that and say, okay, this is how we're going to design a shoe. We're going to make it flexible over here, more traction over there. Like, you've done the research, and then you've provided the input to the people who actually produce the shoes. Like, how do you actually go through and do that?
Yeah, so basically regarding my thesis work, which was mainly about downhill running. So what we figured out from this work is basically that there is no good running strike pattern to minimize muscle fatigue after a downhill section. And so that basically the best option was to try to switch in between different running style, running techniques in order to minimize the load that is put on a given muscle group, right? So this is basically the fundamental outcome of this research. And then this helps us to decide, basically knowing that the drop of the shoe, for example, affects the running technique. This helps us to say, okay, for our next generation of trail running shoes, we should design a shoe with a drop of 8 millimeters in order to allow runners to strike the ground with their forefoot first, but also with their heel first. And so this is one example of how it can go from the lab to the shelf.
Let me follow that all the way through, because this is awesome. So you produced a piece of research. This is your PhD thesis, and I'm very familiar with this because, once again, we've used it a lot. In the summary version, I hate to do this with people who have actually produced the research, because it over trivializes the amount of work and effort that you have put into it.
Yeah, it's okay. This is something that is very important also in Salomon, and I think it's worth mentioning, is that we have to be very straight to the point when we want to explain something complicated. Otherwise, we lose everybody. We lose designers, we lose marketing, we lose developers. So we need to be straight to the point. So
I can appreciate your struggle, because I have to be on both sides of that. I have to understand the underlying nuance, but then I also have to produce the Twitter version. So glad you're not offended by me producing the Twitter version on this. So the Twitter version of it is that you can stave off some type of muscular and/or neuromuscular fatigue by switching from a heel strike to a midfoot strike to a forefoot strike during downhill running. You took that into the footwear side and said, okay, we were going to produce a shoe that is conducive to doing that, just from the drop perspective. And that drop that you guys determined was an 8 millimeter drop. So an athlete can go down a downhill and the drop isn't so big that they couldn't switch from one foot strike pattern to the other. And it's not so narrow that they were forced into another type of foot strike pattern. I take that from a coaching standpoint, and I look at that piece of research. So kudos to you, because it's directly impacted the way that I prescribe and counsel people. And I say, okay, we're going to teach runners how to do this, especially in an ultramarathon situation, because we have a lot of runners that are stuck and cannot move out of a certain foot strike pattern. So if I have a runner that is training for an ultramarathon, that for some reason I feel that it's advantageous for them to delay some sort of muscular and neuromuscular fatigue because of the cumulative downhills, part of the training prescription becomes, okay, let's learn how to heel strike, how to forefoot strike, how to midfoot strike based on the situation, and potentially that can prevent fatigue. So it's like full circle, right? I mean, you get products out of it, I get coaching out of it. It's brilliant.
Yeah. I think that's something regarding this specific topic, something also that is somehow related to this, and I think it's a study that I love. I don't know if you know this study. It's a study that have been done by a university lab in Luxembourg. It's Malissou, the author, and basically what they observe is pretty close at what we observe from a fatigue perspective. They basically observe that if you want it was a study over, I think,
3 years or?
No, it was just 22 weeks, I think, if I well remember. Pretty precise, right?
Precise.
So it was a prospective study over, I think, 20 weeks or something like this. And what they observed is super interesting, is that people that were less injured were those either who use very different type of footwear, so traditional, minimalist, maximalist footwears and so on, or who try also to practice very different kind of activities. And what this tells us basically, and I think it's somehow related to what we observed also in downhill, is that by either switching your footwear or your practice, you avoid overloading certain joints and certain muscle groups and so on. So it's a very interesting solution to try to avoid overloading your body, basically. And I think that's what is very interesting in trail, and what is important in trail is to try to use this kind of let's say, plasticity, variability in your running strike in order to avoid overloading a given joint or given muscle groups and so on. So I think that switching the stimuli is very interesting to reduce fatigue, but also to reduce maybe the risk of injuries over a long term. So
yeah, this aspect of like changing things up, whether it's a foot
yeah.
strike or whatever, has become really fascinating in trail and ultra running. Our mutual colleague, you guys will find this hilarious. This is the second time in 2 days that I've recorded a podcast where I've mentioned this person. I don't know the order that this is going to come out, but it's just funny. So our mutual colleague, Jackson Brill, who was an intern for us about a year ago, he is fascinated with the uphill run to walk transition. And one of the things that we consistently go back and forth about is, yeah, we can always measure the metabolic cost and what's more economical to do, what form of locomotion is more economical to do at what speed and what grade. But it's harder to account for the localized fatigue that's going on at the muscular level and the neuromuscular level to determine what you should be doing at any kind of one point in time. And this aspect of changing your foot strike, either to prevent injury or to delay fatigue, has a similar vibe to it, right? Where it's not just an economy thing, because we know when runners switch foot strikes, initially their economy is worse. They're used to being a heel striker, they switch to a forefoot striker. At least initially, the economy's worse, but that doesn't tell the whole story, nor does that tell you what direction you should be counseling the athlete on from a performance or an injury prevention type of standpoint. So it's interesting to see those themes kind of getting woven throughout everything, especially in trail running, because it's just everything, right? Running, walking, uphill, downhill, flats, technical, fast, slow, poles, which is a completely different thing. It's like a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
Sure.
And
I think that trail running is a very nice way and easy way to develop this plasticity, because you do that without thinking about it. I mean, you have to change your running strike most of the time because the surface is changing, because the slope is changing or whatever. So it's a very easy and interesting way to develop this plasticity, this biomechanical plasticity. I think it's
100%. So I asked you guys earlier about what potentially could come out, and I understand that you guys got to keep a lid on certain things. I totally get that. But I'm going to ask you another question where you can let your imagination just completely run wild. What do you want to come out? Like, if you could have an unlimited budget and wave your magic wand and just do anything, you can have any toys, you can have any type of research, you want to try to find like any answer, what would you actually want to apply those resources to?
I can start.
Yeah, sure.
So
Go on.
I don't think that there is a perfect shoe. I'm convinced that we can do all the innovation that we want. There is no perfect shoe, but I think that if I would have a magic stick to do that, I would spend it to put the right person in the right shoe, and in just like one click on on the website or whatever, you can say, okay, I need this shoe and I will be less injured or more performant, or I would be more comfortable with this shoe. And in just one click, you have the answer. Because I think that most of the people, I think that they are totally lost in a shoe shelf. And I would spend all my energy to say, you have to choose this shoe.
I would buy that, and I love your their shoe shelf. I've never heard that before, but that's so relatable, Marlene. I love that. All right, Sebastien, you have to follow that up now.
Yeah, I heard a few time ago about a technology that is called, I guess it's called Protocell. And it's something, it's kind of a biological fabric that is 3D printed. And it has the capacity to basically adapt actively to any constraint or any stress that you apply to it. And if I had, well, maybe it's not a magic one because the technology is existing, but if I had a lot of money, I would invest on this technology and say how we can make a shoe based on this technology so that the shoe, you only have one, right? You put this at your feet, and then whatever you do, wherever you do, it adapts to the situation. If you start running, it's going to start increasing in stack and giving you the right amount of cushioning. If you start running uphill, it's going to lose some weight and help you to be more efficient in the uphill situation. If you slow down and you start walking, it's going to adapt as well. Then you just go back and you go to the city and you start walking on the asphalt. It can adapt as well. So
it's kind of doping.
It's like maybe it's a little doping, but it could be that it does not enhance your performance, but just adapts to the situation. You're walking, you're running in the mud. There are some lugs that are appearing on what we could call the outsole, because I don't know if we could if we would name the spare parts the same way. But if I had some high budget to allocate to something, I would say let's go into that.
Well, it's almost an extension. I'm going to use an analogy from another sport. It's like a more robust version of a dropper post in mountain biking. So for those of the listeners that aren't familiar, a dropper post in mountain biking just allows you to lower your seat automatically with the flick of a switch at your handlebars. So if you're climbing and you need to sit on the seat, you've got it in the up position. But then if you hit some gnarly piece of downhill and you want the seat kind of out of the way for better maneuverability, you can hit this thing and it'll actually kind of drop down. You're talking about that on the shoe version from a lot of different levels, and thinking like even down to the tightness of the laces, right? Which BOA kind of has that, but it's a manual process right now. I mean, where you can switch that from a really technical tight situation to more loose if that's what the situation dictates. I'd buy both of those concepts just for the record. So I would encourage you to find the budget to do that. You'd have at least one consumer in New York.
If you have a few bucks to invest, please feel free.
I don't know if I could come up with the funding. That's my limiting factor. All right, you guys, I really appreciate the time that you spent with me today. This was extremely fun, entertaining. Where can the listeners find out a little bit more about either you two as individuals or like what you guys do for Salomon?
Want to start?
Was it?
So for my part, so I have a scientific background into biomechanics. I graduated from my master degree. It was 8 years ago, and my PhD was defended. I defended my PhD in 2016, but I started working for Salomon in 2012. So meaning that my PhD project was in the same time as my first years as a Salomon biomechanist, and so my main missions and my job evolved from testing products basically in the lab and mostly on this validation part that we talked earlier, taking concept and saying, okay, is it working or not, to more managing some scientific projects into different areas. I worked on the ultra trail shoe. I worked on this customized project, and right now I work on this innovation project about recommending some shoes, like we said before, and yeah, that's basically it. It's more it's a more global position. I'm not working 100% of my time in the lab. I'm more on the project managing part, let's say, on this innovation project. And yeah, I guess that's it for my part.
Marlene?
Same as Seb, almost. No, so I arrived in Salomon. I think 1 month after Seb.
Also,
yeah, something like this. So he's my brother, let's say. and yeah, so I did a PhD in biomechanics and neurosciences. And the application of this is mainly in trail running, as I said during the podcast. And same as Seb, at the beginning, I was really involved in product development and also in the research part of this product development, and especially on in trail running and in road running. And today, my main focus is to try to better understand the users, and this through a very sports sciences approach, so using biomechanics, using physiology, and so on, but also using sensory analysis and behavior sciences, this kind of stuff, in order to really understand, to have a very complete description of the users, and not just his biomechanics, his physiology, but also to understand all his or her environment, basically, and whole his person and who he is really, and not just biomechanics. So to have a very exhaustive description of the users, of the runners. And this is my main mission today. So it's still a lot of and more research again. I'm getting away from the validation part. So my main focus is really on to better understand who is our users, in order to address his or her specific needs, and using very different kind of methodologies like biomechanics, physiology, sensory analysis, and so on.
Well, I appreciate what both of you guys do. As I mentioned in the earlier part of the podcast, I think you guys do it right, where you let the science lead and you put a lot of thought and careful attention to detail into the products that you produce. So it's appreciated by me as a coach, and I know that your athletes appreciate it as well. I'm going to have to visit you guys' lab the next time I drive from Geneva to Chamonix for UTMB, because every time I go up that highway and I see the Annecy turnoff, I'm like, God, I got to go to the Salomon lab just to like go check it out. So if you guys will indulge me, I'd be very much appreciative of it.
You're welcome.
More than welcome.
You are more than welcome. Yeah.
And there you have it. There you go. Much thanks to Sebastien and Marlene over at Salomon for their time today. That was a really intriguing conversation. I'm always curious to know how research done in the laboratory and out in the field actually ends up on our feet and on our persons. Hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. If you did, head on over to Apple Podcasts and give this podcast a rating or a review. That helps the podcast out tremendously and also means a lot to me personally. All right, that's it for today, you guys. As always, we will see you out on the trails.